The oldest dog in the shelter had stopped wagging his tail months ago, until the day she quietly said hello. Snow drifted softly over Maple Falls, the kind of small American town where people still waved from pickup trucks but somehow forgot to ask whether anyone was lonely. Winter had settled in early that year, covering rooftops in pale white silence while Christmas decorations hung half-heartedly from old storefront windows downtown. Most afternoons, the town moved slowly. Coffee shops emptied early. Streets grew quiet before sunset. And somewhere beneath all that ordinary stillness, loneliness sat quietly inside more homes than anyone cared to admit. Claire Bennett knew something about silence. At 42 years old, she had become unusually good at living beside it. Her small white house at the edge of town stayed clean, warm enough, and painfully quiet after sunset. Books stacked neatly beside the couch. A single lamp glowing near the window. Tea growing cold beside unfinished novels she barely read anymore. Since losing her mother nearly 2 years earlier, evenings somehow felt longer than they used to. Grief had changed shape over time. It no longer felt sharp, just heavy, quiet, like carrying something invisible nobody else remembered to ask about. Most mornings, Claire worked at the town library organizing returned books, helping children find stories, and quietly recommending novels to retirees who mostly came for company. She smiled often enough, asked polite questions, remembered birthdays. But loneliness had a strange way of hiding inside kind people. Sometimes nobody noticed because quiet people learned how to look fine. That afternoon, snow tapped gently against her windshield as she sat parked outside the Maple Falls Animal Shelter, holding a paper cup of coffee gone mostly cold. She had no real reason for coming. At least none she could explain properly. Maybe the house felt too quiet again. Maybe winter had started feeling heavier. Or maybe something deep inside her had simply grown tired of eating dinner alone every night while pretending solitude still felt peaceful. The shelter building looked older than she remembered. Brick walls faded from years of weather. A hand-painted sign leaning slightly crooked near the entrance. Through fogged windows, she could see volunteers moving slowly between kennels while soft barking echoed faintly through cold air. Claire hesitated before stepping out. Just looking, she whispered quietly to herself. The smell hit gently when she stepped inside. Warm air mixed with soap, old blankets, and that familiar shelter scent made from hope and sadness somehow living in the same room. Near the front desk sat an older woman folding towels. Late 60s maybe, gray curls tucked beneath a knitted sweater. She smiled kindly the moment Claire walked in. "Cold one out there," she said warmly. Claire smiled politely. "Feels colder every year." "You looking to adopt?" the woman asked. Claire hesitated. "Honestly," she admitted softly, "I am not really sure." The woman nodded gently like uncertainty belonged here too. "Well," she said kindly, "sometimes animals know before people do." Her name tag read Martha. Behind them, younger dogs barked excitedly from nearby kennels, tails wagging wildly whenever someone walked by. A golden retriever jumped eagerly against a gate. 2 puppies wrestled loudly near the corner. Noise, energy, hope. Claire smiled faintly but kept walking slowly. Then she noticed something strange. Near the very back of the room, far from the excited barking, one kennel stayed almost completely quiet. No movement, no sound. Just an old German shepherd lying calmly against a folded blanket in the corner. Silver-brown fur gone pale around the muzzle. Cloudy winter sunlight touching tired eyes that barely lifted when people passed. No barking, no begging, no desperate tail wagging. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that somehow felt familiar. Claire slowed without meaning to. "What about him?" she asked quietly. Martha looked over and sighed softly. "That is Rusty." Something about the way she said his name sounded heavier than the others. "He is 13, Martha explained while stepping beside Claire. "Oldest dog we have." She paused gently. "Probably the sickest too." Claire looked closer. Rusty's frame seemed thinner than it should have been. Age settling into his body quietly. But his eyes stayed sharp somehow. Calm. Thoughtful. Watching without expectation. "Nobody wants him?" Claire asked softly. Martha gave a sad smile. "Most folks want puppies." She glanced toward the older dog. Rusty mostly gets overlooked. Snow tapped quietly against shelter windows, while somewhere nearby younger dogs barked for attention again. Rusty stayed still. Patient somehow. Like wanting had become too exhausting. Claire stepped closer to the kennel without fully realizing why. The German shepherd slowly lifted his head. Their eyes met for the first time. Something shifted quietly inside her chest. Not dramatic. Not instant magic. Just recognition somehow. Loneliness recognizing loneliness. Claire crouched slowly near the gate. Hey! For a long moment, neither Claire nor the old German shepherd moved. Snow drifted softly against the shelter windows while the sound of barking from younger dogs echoed somewhere farther down the hallway, full of energy and hope that still believed tomorrow belonged to them. But near the back kennel, something quieter existed. Something older. Rusty kept his head resting gently against the gate near Claire's hand, as though effort itself had become precious over time. Claire stayed crouched longer than she expected. Hey, she whispered softly again, fingers resting lightly near the cold metal bars. Rusty blinked once. Calm, patient, no excitement, no desperate tail wagging, just quiet attention. Somehow that made her chest ache more than anything else could have. Martha stood nearby with folded towels pressed gently against one arm. That is the first time he has walked over to somebody this week, she said quietly. Claire looked up slightly. Really? Martha nodded. He mostly keeps to himself lately. Her voice softened. The vet says arthritis. Some heart trouble. He sleeps a lot now. She paused carefully. Truth is, we figured nobody would adopt him. Claire looked back at Rusty. Old age rested quietly around his eyes, but there was something else there too. Something strangely steady. Wise maybe. Like he had spent years learning patience after disappointment. What happened to his family? Claire asked softly. Martha sighed through her nose. Older couple adopted him years ago. Snow brushed lightly across the windows behind them while shelter lights hummed softly overhead. The husband passed first, Martha explained. Then the wife got sick. Family moved away afterward and said they could not take him. Claire looked down again immediately. Rusty lowered his head slightly, though whether he understood the story or simply recognized sadness, she could not tell. That was 6 months ago, Martha added quietly. Nobody really looks twice at old dogs. The sentence landed heavier than Claire expected, because loneliness had strange echoes sometimes. Being left behind rarely announced itself loudly. More often it arrived quietly, through empty dinner tables, unanswered phone calls, houses that somehow felt bigger after loss. Claire understood that feeling more than she liked admitting. Can I? She hesitated briefly. Can I sit with him for a minute? Martha smiled gently. Of course. A few minutes later, Claire sat quietly inside Rusty's kennel near a folded blanket while soft shelter sounds moved around them. Snow continued falling outside. Somewhere nearby, volunteers laughed softly while cleaning food bowls. But inside the small kennel, everything slowed. Rusty lowered himself carefully beside her without hesitation, old joints moving slower than they probably once had. Then, after settling beside her leg, he rested his head gently against her knee like it belonged there. Claire let out a soft breath she had not realized she was holding. You really are tired, huh? She whispered. Rusty closed his eyes briefly. Calm. Safe somehow. She rested one careful hand against his fur. Thicker than expected. Warm. Familiar in a way she could not explain. It had been years since something leaned on her for comfort. Years since the house held anything except silence after dark. Funny thing was, she had come to the shelter thinking maybe she only wanted company. But sitting here now beside an old dog nobody else wanted, something deeper stirred quietly beneath grief she had stopped talking about long ago. Martha returned sometime later holding paperwork she clearly did not expect to use. No pressure, she said kindly. But if you are considering it, we have a senior adoption program. Claire almost laughed softly at herself. This is going to sound ridiculous, she admitted quietly. But I only came here because the house felt too quiet today. Martha smiled gently. Funny thing about animals, she said. Sometimes they know exactly when quiet turns into loneliness. Claire looked down toward Rusty again. He had not moved, still resting beside her, trusting in a way that felt strangely undeserved after only an hour. Then something unexpected happened. Claire slowly stood, brushing snow from her coat. I should probably think about it, she said softly. Rusty stood too, slow but steady. She smiled faintly. You want me to come back tomorrow? Rusty took one careful step forward and gently pressed his head against her hand again. Not begging, not demanding, just quiet certainty. As though somewhere inside himself, waiting had finally started feeling unnecessary. Claire swallowed quietly. Something inside her shifted again. Small but impossible to ignore. The kind of feeling people usually talk themselves out of because practical decisions felt safer. Old dogs cost money. Old dogs came with heartbreak already waiting somewhere ahead. Sensible people chose younger dogs. Healthier dogs. Easier dogs. Yet somehow none of those thoughts felt louder than the strange warmth settling quietly inside her chest. If you are enjoying this story so far, please do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more unforgettable stories like this one. Claire looked toward Martha and exhaled slowly. What do I need to sign? Martha blinked once in surprise. You mean? Claire nodded quietly. I think he has waited long enough. For the first time since she had entered the shelter, something changed in Rusty. Nothing dramatic. No excited barking. No jumping. Just the faintest movement of his tail against the blanket. Slow. Gentle. Like hope returning carefully after spending too much time forgotten. The drive home happened slower than Claire expected. Snow drifted softly across the windshield while Rusty sat quietly in the back seat of her aging blue SUV wrapped carefully in an extra blanket Martha had insisted they take. The old German Shepherd barely moved during the 40-minute drive through winding roads outside Maple Falls. No whining. No pacing. No nervousness. Just calm silence. Every now and then Claire glanced into the rearview mirror expecting uncertainty. But Rusty simply rested there watching snowy trees pass like somebody who had already spent too much of life learning how to adapt. The strange part was how natural it already felt. Like he belonged in the empty space behind her seat somehow. Like loneliness itself had quietly shifted shape. Well, Claire said softly while turning onto her road. I hope you like quiet. Rusty blinked once and lowered his head back onto the blanket. Outside, winter stretched calmly across Maple Falls. Smoke rose from chimneys. Porch lights glowed softly against growing evening snow. The kind of town where everybody knew one another, but somehow still forgot how lonely people could become after dark. Claire's house sat near the edge of town beneath tall pine trees dusted white. Small. Modest. White siding beginning to age around the corners. A front porch swing her mother once loved, still hanging quietly beneath the roof. Home had felt strangely hollow since the funeral nearly 2 years earlier. Too much silence. Too many untouched routines. Yet something about opening the passenger door now, while hearing another quiet presence behind her, made the place feel slightly different. Rusty climbed down slowly from the SUV. Careful movements. Older joints adjusting to cold pavement. Claire crouched instinctively. Easy, she said softly. No rush. Rusty paused near her for a second before quietly following her toward the porch. No pulling. No excitement. Just trust. Inside, warmth greeted them immediately. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and old books. Living room lamps glowed softly against pale walls lined with family photographs. Her mother smiling beside summer flowers. Childhood vacations. Holidays that somehow felt much farther away now. Claire set her keys carefully near the kitchen counter and turned back. Rusty stood quietly near the doorway watching everything with patient eyes. Not nervous, just observant. Like he understood unfamiliar spaces required gentleness. Okay, Claire said quietly, exhaling once. I guess this is home now. Rusty slowly walked into the living room, nose moving carefully through the air. He paused beside the couch, looked briefly toward the hallway. Then, without hesitation, walked directly toward the old armchair near the fireplace. Her mother's chair. Claire stopped moving immediately. The chair had mostly stayed untouched since the funeral. Nobody sat there anymore. She had never consciously decided that. It just happened. Some grief arrived quietly and stayed longer than expected. Rusty lowered himself slowly onto the rug beside the chair with a quiet sigh and rested his head near one of the wooden legs. Calm. Comfortable. Like the space somehow made sense to him. Claire stood completely still for a moment. That is strange, she whispered softly. Because somehow it did not feel sad. Not really. More familiar. Gentle somehow. Like memory softening instead of hurting. That night, dinner felt different too. Claire heated canned soup, toasted bread, and found herself checking twice whether Rusty had enough water nearby. He ate slowly, carefully, every movement showing age but also gratitude somehow. No rushing. No mess. Afterward, while snow continued falling outside, Claire settled onto the couch beneath a blanket with a book she had already tried reading 3 times this month. Usually evenings stretched endlessly. Television humming quietly for background noise she barely listened to. But tonight felt different. Not louder exactly, just less empty. Rusty remained near the fireplace most of the evening, occasionally lifting his head to glance toward her before settling back down again. At some point, Claire caught herself speaking out loud without realizing it. "Library was busy today," she said softly while turning a page she had barely read. Rusty looked up calmly. "Mrs. Holloway still checks out mystery novels even though she falls asleep halfway through them." His ears moved slightly. Claire laughed quietly before realizing something unexpected. She had not laughed alone in this house for months. Later that evening, after brushing snow gently from the windows near the front door, Claire headed upstairs toward bed. Halfway up the staircase, she hesitated. "You can sleep downstairs if you want," she said quietly. "No pressure." Rusty looked at her from the bottom step. Then, slowly, carefully, he climbed after her. One step at a time. No hesitation. Like he had already decided where home belonged. Upstairs, Claire unfolded extra blankets near her bed. "Temporary arrangement," she said softly with a faint smile. "Until we figure things out." Rusty circled once before lowering himself onto the blankets with a quiet groan of tired old bones. Calm. Safe. Before turning off the lamp, Claire looked over once more. The next few mornings settled into a rhythm neither Claire nor Rusty seemed to question. Snow stayed thick along sidewalks while Maple Falls moved quietly through another hard winter week. Mornings began with coffee warming in the kitchen, soft jazz humming faintly from the old radio, and the gentle sound of Rusty's slow footsteps moving across wooden floors. He had already learned the house quickly, where sunlight touched the living room rug around 10 in the morning, which kitchen cabinet held treats, which creaky stair Claire always avoided because it squealed too loudly before sunrise. Somehow, without trying, he had slipped quietly into routines that used to feel painfully empty. Every morning before work, Claire filled Rusty's food bowl while quietly talking to him about ordinary things. "Big library meeting today," she would say while buttoning her winter coat. "Mrs. Holloway is probably going to ask where her mystery books when even though they are sitting in her living room." Rusty would look up calmly from his blanket near the fireplace, ears shifting slightly like he understood more than he let on. One snowy afternoon about 2 weeks after bringing him home, Claire clipped Rusty's leash onto his collar for their usual walk through town. The old German shepherd moved slower than younger dogs, but there was purpose in the way he walked. Careful, deliberate, like every stop mattered somehow. Main Street looked almost postcard perfect beneath fresh snow. Small storefronts glowing warmly against gray skies. Steam rising from coffee shop windows. Christmas lights still hanging even though the holiday had passed weeks ago. Claire usually walked quickly through town. Polite smiles. Short conversations. Then home again before loneliness had too much time to feel heavy. But walks with Rusty moved differently. Slower. Softer somehow. People noticed him. Maybe because of his age. Maybe because old dogs carried something honest in their faces younger dogs had not learned yet. Outside the bakery, an elderly man sat alone on a bench wrapped tightly in an old wool coat despite the cold. Claire recognized him vaguely. Walter Briggs. Retired mechanic. Widower. Quiet man who mostly kept to himself after losing his wife several years earlier. Rusty stopped walking. Completely. Claire looked down. "Come on, buddy," she said gently. Rusty did not move. Instead, he turned slightly and walked directly toward the bench. Slow steps. Calm certainty. Walter looked up with surprise as the German shepherd approached and quietly lowered himself near his boots. No barking. No excitement. Just presence. "Well now," Walter said softly, blinking once. "Ain't seen a shepherd this handsome in years." Claire smiled apologetically. "Sorry. He seems to like stopping unexpectedly." Walter bent slightly, gloved hand brushing carefully across Rusty's head. Something softened immediately across the older man's face. "Used to have one," he said quietly. "Years ago." Snow drifted gently around them while traffic moved slowly down Main Street. Claire hesitated, unsure whether to stay or politely leave. But Rusty stayed exactly where he was. Calm. Patient. Like moving too soon would somehow be rude. Walter scratched gently behind Rusty's ears. "Funny thing," he said quietly after a moment. This is the first time I have sat outside longer than 10 minutes in months. Claire looked toward him more carefully now. Loneliness recognized loneliness sometimes. You live nearby? She asked softly. Walter nodded toward a small house across town. Mostly just me now. He smiled faintly. Gets quiet. Something inside Claire tightened gently. Familiar? Yeah, she said quietly. I understand that. For a little while, none of them moved. Just quiet conversation drifting beneath cold winter skies, while Rusty rested calmly between them like this had somehow been his idea all along. Later that week, something similar happened again. During another afternoon walk near the grocery store, Rusty suddenly slowed near a young waitress sitting alone outside, holding coffee in trembling hands between double shifts. Exhaustion covered her face. Dark circles beneath tired eyes. Rusty walked gently toward her and sat without hesitation. The woman looked startled before smiling despite herself. Hey there, she whispered softly. For 10 quiet minutes, Claire found herself learning the woman's name was Emily. 26. Working 2 jobs after medical bills overwhelmed her family. Nobody dramatic. Just struggling quietly, like so many people did. On the walk home, Claire frowned softly while glancing down at Rusty. Okay, she murmured quietly. That is twice now. Rusty kept walking calmly beside her, tail moving once against the snow, as though explanations were unnecessary. A few days later, something stranger happened. Near sunset, while walking past the edge of town, Rusty suddenly turned down a road Claire almost never used. Wrong way, she called softly. But the old dog kept moving. Slow, certain, purposeful, past shuttered storefronts and older brick buildings nobody visited much anymore. Then finally, he stopped, directly in front of an old building sitting quietly beneath heavy snow. Tall windows dusty from neglect. Sign faded almost beyond recognition. Maple Falls Community Hall. Closed nearly 10 years ago. Claire stared quietly. What are we doing here? She whispered softly. Rusty stepped closer to the locked front door and sat, watching it carefully, waiting. Snow settled softly onto his aging fur while cold wind moved through empty streets around them. Then, slowly, the old German shepherd lowered one paw and touched the frozen wooden steps almost gently, like he remembered something nobody else did. Snow settled softly across Maple Falls that evening while Claire stood quietly in front of the old community hall, hands tucked deeper into her coat pockets against the cold. Rusty remained seated near the frozen wooden steps without moving. Calm, certain somehow. The old German shepherd watched the building with the same quiet focus he carried whenever something seemed important. Claire looked up at the faded sign again. Maple Falls Community Hall. She had not thought about the place in years. Nobody really had. The building used to matter once. Potluck dinners, holiday gatherings, charity drives, school fundraisers, community breakfasts every Saturday morning before life somehow became busier and lonelier at the same time. Then budgets changed. Fewer volunteers showed up. Repairs became expensive. Eventually the doors closed and stayed closed. People stopped gathering. Claire looked down toward Rusty. What exactly are you trying to tell me? She asked softly. Rusty blinked once and remained where he was, snow gathering lightly across silver fur around his shoulders. Not impatient, just waiting, like answers had never needed rushing. Finally, Claire sighed through cold air. Okay, she whispered. One more minute. She climbed the front steps slowly, boots creaking softly against frozen wood. The front windows looked dusty now, though faint shapes still sat inside beneath shadows. Folding chairs stacked against walls. Tables pushed into corners. Forgotten things. The kind of place nobody intentionally abandoned, but somehow still left behind anyway. Then something unexpected happened. Rusty stood slowly and walked closer beside her. He stopped near the front door and gently pressed his nose near the bottom edge like he smelled something familiar. Claire frowned slightly. You have never even been here before, she murmured quietly. Yet something about the moment unsettled her in a strangely gentle way. Not fear. Recognition somehow. Like forgotten memories trying carefully to return. On the walk home, snow falling softly beneath old streetlights, Claire could not stop thinking about the building. Or Walter sitting quietly alone outside the bakery. Or Emily holding coffee between exhausted hands during double shifts. Lonely people seemed everywhere lately once she started noticing them. Maybe they had always been there. Maybe loneliness only became visible once somebody stopped hiding their own. Back home, warmth greeted them again. Rusty moved immediately toward the fireplace rug, while Claire hung her coat and placed water on the stove for tea. Outside, snow tapped softly against windows while wind moved gently through pine branches. The house felt warmer now somehow, less silent, like loneliness no longer had the whole room to itself. Later that night, while curled beneath a blanket with tea resting between both hands, Claire found herself scrolling through old Maple Falls community pages online. Photographs surfaced slowly. Community hall and better days. Holiday dinners. Veteran breakfasts. Food drives during hard winters. Families laughing around folding tables. One picture stopped her. Nearly 15 years old. A free Christmas dinner inside the hall. Elderly residents sitting beside young families. Volunteers serving soup. Smiles everywhere. And near the front corner stood Walter Briggs looking younger beside his wife. Claire stared quietly for a long moment. Then another image. Local fundraiser after a factory closure. Emily's father standing with volunteers years before medical bills changed everything. Everyone connected somehow. Strange. Like the whole town once knew how to hold one another up before life slowly grew quieter. The next afternoon after work, Claire found herself walking back toward the bakery with Rusty. Snow melted slightly beneath weak winter sunlight. Walter sat outside again. Same bench, same old wool coat. But this time when Rusty approached, the older man smiled immediately. "Well, look who decided to visit," he said warmly. Rusty settled beside him again without hesitation. Claire smiled softly. "Seems like you made a friend." Walter scratched behind Rusty's ears carefully. "Best part of my week lately," he admitted quietly. Then after a pause, he looked toward Claire. "Funny thing is, after you left the other day," he hesitated briefly. "I actually called my son." Claire blinked once. "Really?" Walter nodded. Had not spoken much in months. He smiled faintly. "Guess sitting here with this old dog got me thinking maybe people spend too much time waiting for the other person to call first." Something warm moved unexpectedly through Claire's chest. Small, quiet, important somehow. Later, Emily waved from outside the diner when Claire passed. Smiling this time. Tired still, but lighter somehow. "Tell your dog thanks," she called softly. "That coffee break helped more than he probably knows." Claire looked down toward Rusty as they continued walking. "Okay," she murmured quietly. "You are officially weird." Rusty's tail moved once through melting snow. Calm as ever. Then, halfway home, instead of turning toward their street, Rusty slowed. Stopped. Looked back at Claire. Then gently turned again toward the old community hall. Purposeful. Patient. Like he was not finished showing her something yet. The old community hall looked even quieter beneath late afternoon snow. Faded brick walls stood patiently against winter wind, while tall windows reflected pale gray skies across empty streets. Claire stood near the front steps with both hands tucked into her coat pockets, breath visible in the cold air. Rusty sat near the entrance again, calm as ever, amber eyes fixed toward the old wooden doors like they held something important nobody else remembered. "Okay," Claire said softly while exhaling through the cold. "You have officially brought me here too many times for this to be random." Rusty glanced back at her once before lowering himself near the frozen steps again. Waiting. Certain somehow. Like answers arrived when people stopped rushing. Claire climbed the front porch slowly and peered again through dusty windows. Inside sat shadows of forgotten things. Folding chairs stacked carelessly. Tables covered beneath faded sheets. A coat rack leaning slightly crooked near the entrance. Dust everywhere. Quiet everywhere. Once, this building had mattered. She remembered coming here as a little girl holding her mother's hand during Christmas dinners and school fundraisers. Soup nights. Pancake breakfasts. Community concerts where nobody sang especially well, but everyone stayed anyway because together mattered more than perfect. Somewhere along the way, Maple Falls had quietly stopped gathering. People got busier. Bills got harder. Loss settled into homes nobody talked about. Then one day the doors simply stopped opening. Rusty stood slowly beside her. Without warning, he nudged gently against her hand before lowering himself again near the entrance. Claire frowned slightly. "What?" she whispered. Then she noticed something taped crookedly beside the old door beneath years of weather damage. "Town property notice." She leaned closer. "Property maintained by Maple Falls Community Board. Key available through Town Hall office." Claire blinked once. "Well," she murmured softly. That seems suspiciously convenient. Rusty's tail moved once against the snow. Not excitement, just quiet patience. The next morning, after library hours ended early because of weather, Claire found herself standing awkwardly inside town hall holding paperwork she still did not fully understand. Mayor Thomas Reed stood near his office doorway, looking mildly surprised. Late 50s. Practical man. Good reputation. Quiet around town after losing his wife years earlier. Community hall? He repeated while adjusting reading glasses. Nobody has asked about that place in forever. Claire hesitated briefly. I know this probably sounds strange, she admitted softly. But I think maybe. She glanced briefly toward Rusty resting quietly near the office doorway. Maybe the town still needs it. Thomas followed her gaze toward the old German shepherd. Something softened faintly across his expression. That dog yours? Claire nodded. Adopted him recently. Thomas smiled faintly. Funny enough, he said quietly. My wife used to volunteer at the shelter. Silence settled briefly between them. Familiar silence. The kind people shared after grief had stayed too long. Finally, he sighed softly. Building still technically belongs to the town, he said. Nobody has money to renovate it, though. He paused carefully. But if somebody wanted temporary access for community use, he reached slowly toward a drawer and removed an old brass key. Guess no rule says you cannot try. Claire stared at the key for a second longer than necessary. Somehow things suddenly felt real. Scary too. I do not even know what I would do with it, she admitted quietly. Thomas smiled sadly. Sometimes towns just need somebody willing to unlock the door first. That evening, snow melted softly along sidewalks while Claire unlocked the old hall for the first time in nearly a decade. The front door creaked loudly as warm flashlight beams moved across dust-covered floors. Rusty stepped inside immediately. Calm. Certain. Like he already belonged here. The room smelled faintly of old wood, forgotten winters, and memories nobody visited anymore. Folding tables still lined one wall. Kitchen equipment sat untouched beneath faded covers. Bulletin boards held old flyers from fundraisers long finished. Claire walked slowly through the space, while flashlight light danced softly across shadows. Strange thing was, it did not feel abandoned exactly. More like paused. Waiting somehow. Rusty wandered carefully through the room before stopping near the center of the hall. Then, without hesitation, he lowered himself beside the old fireplace. Calm. Comfortable. Like he had finally arrived where he wanted to be all along. Claire stood quietly for a moment, then suddenly remembered Walter. Sitting alone outside the bakery. Emily working herself exhausted. Mrs. Holloway wandering the library longer than necessary because going home felt too quiet. So many lonely people. Quiet people. Good people carrying invisible things. Maybe Maple Falls had not stopped needing community. Maybe everyone had simply forgotten how to ask for it. The idea arrived quietly. Small at first. Ridiculous even. Soup. Coffee. Folding tables. Nothing dramatic. Just somewhere warm where lonely people did not have to sit alone for a few hours. Claire laughed softly to herself despite how impossible it sounded. This is a terrible idea, she murmured. Rusty lifted his head calmly from the floor. Watching her. Waiting. Then somehow, standing inside a forgotten building beside an old dog nobody else wanted, the terrible idea suddenly felt strangely right. For the next several days, Claire tried very hard to convince herself the idea was unrealistic. Every practical part of her brain insisted the whole thing sounded impossible. The old community hall needed cleaning. Heating barely worked. Nobody gathered anymore. People had jobs, schedules, problems, reasons not to show up. Small towns liked nostalgia, but often forgot how to rebuild what they missed. Yet every afternoon after work, somehow, she found herself unlocking the hall anyway. Rusty always walked beside her through fresh snow with the same quiet certainty, as though he had already decided something important before she caught up to the plan. The first afternoon, they mostly cleaned. Dust floated through pale winter sunlight, while old folding chairs scraped softly across wooden floors. Claire wrapped a scarf tighter around her neck and laughed quietly to herself, while carrying forgotten decorations into storage boxes. You know, she muttered toward Rusty resting near the fireplace. Normal people do not suddenly decide to reopen abandoned buildings. Rusty lifted his head slightly. Calm. Watching. Like normal had never solved loneliness anyway. The second afternoon, Walter showed up unexpectedly carrying an old toolbox. Mayor said somebody finally unlocked the place, he said while brushing snow from his boots. Claire blinked in surprise. I was mostly just cleaning. Walter nodded once toward the heating vents overhead. Building gets cold fast, he said simply. Thought maybe somebody ought to fix that. They worked mostly in comfortable silence. Rusty rested nearby between them, occasionally lifting his head whenever either person paused too long in thought. Something strange happened in those quiet hours. Conversation returned naturally. Walter talked about his late wife for the first time in years. Claire talked about missing her mother without suddenly feeling guilty for it. Nobody forced anything. The room simply felt warmer than empty houses did. A few days later, Emily stopped by carrying coffee after hearing about the cleanup from somebody at the diner. I only have 30 minutes, she said apologetically, then stayed nearly 3 hours helping wipe tables and organize storage closets. Feels nice being somewhere that is not work, she admitted quietly. More people started appearing in strange little ways. Mrs. Holloway from the library arrived carrying boxes of old board games she had kept in her attic for years. The local pastor dropped off donated soup pots. Somebody from the grocery store quietly offered leftover bread. Mayor Thomas delivered folding tables with a tired smile and muttered something about, maybe this town's still remembering how to help. Through all of it, Rusty somehow stayed near whoever needed company most. Walter when grief settled too heavily. Emily after difficult shifts. Mrs. Holloway when loneliness slipped quietly into conversation. Nobody said much about it at first, yet somehow everyone started asking the same thing eventually. How does he always know? Claire never had a good answer. The old German shepherd simply moved gently through the hall, like he understood something people often forgot. That kindness usually arrived quietly. One snowy Friday afternoon, standing beside stacked soup cans in the kitchen, Claire finally took a long breath and said the thing she had quietly avoided saying out loud. What if we just tried? She asked softly. Walter looked up from repairing an old heater vent. Tried what? Claire hesitated briefly. One dinner, she said. Nothing fancy. Soup. Coffee. Warm place for people to sit. Emily blinked. Like, community night? Claire nodded uncertainly. Maybe people come. Maybe nobody comes. She laughed quietly through nerves. Honestly, maybe this is a terrible idea. Walter leaned back against the wall thoughtfully. Worst case, he said after a moment. A few lonely people eat soup together. Silence settled briefly. Then Mrs. Holloway smiled from near the tables. That does not sound terrible at all. The flyer almost did not happen. Claire nearly talked herself out of it 6 different times. Yet somehow, by sunset, handwritten signs appeared around town. Free soup and coffee night. Maple Falls Community Hall. Thursday at 6. No cost. Everyone welcome. Simple. Small. No expectations. The whole week leading up to it, Claire quietly prepared herself for disappointment. Winter storms grew heavier. Roads stayed icy. Small towns forgot plans all the time. But Thursday evening arrived anyway. Snow drifted softly through dark skies, while warm lights glowed from community hall windows for the first time in nearly 10 years. Folding tables stood ready. Soup simmered quietly in large silver pots. Coffee warmed near the back counter. Walter checked heaters twice. Emily arranged napkins nervously. Claire stood near the doorway adjusting chairs for the 10th time, while doubt settled heavily into her chest. Nobody is coming, she whispered quietly. Rusty rested beside the entrance, calm as ever, watching the door, waiting. Then, just after 6, someone knocked softly against the front glass. Walter straightened immediately. Claire looked up. Standing outside beneath falling snow stood an elderly woman wrapped in a winter coat. Then another figure behind her. Then someone else. And someone else after that. Rusty stood slowly near the entrance, tail moving once against the floor like somehow, quietly, he had known all along. For a moment, nobody inside the old community hall moved. Snow drifted quietly beyond the windows while warm yellow light spilled gently across the front steps outside. Claire stood frozen near the doorway, hands tightening slightly around a stack of paper cups she suddenly forgot she was holding. Walter slowly adjusted his glasses near the heater. Emily stopped arranging napkins halfway through the task. Even Rusty stood quietly near the entrance, old body steady despite age, tail moving once against the floor like this moment somehow felt familiar to him. Then another soft knock came against the glass. Claire finally stepped forward and opened the door. Cold winter air slipped inside, immediately carrying snowflakes and the smell of pine. An older woman wrapped tightly in a knitted scarf stood smiling uncertainly. "I saw the flyer," she said softly. "Hope it is all right if I stop by." Behind her stood 2 more people from town. Then a younger man holding his daughter's hand. Then another elderly couple carrying containers of cookies nobody had asked them to bring. Claire blinked once, overwhelmed in the gentlest possible way. "Of course," she said quietly. "Come in." Something shifted after that. Slowly at first, then all at once. Chairs filled one table at a time. Coats draped across old wooden hooks near the entrance. Coffee poured into paper cups while soup steamed gently beneath warm lights. Conversation returned awkwardly at first, the way people talk after forgetting what community sounds like. Small things, weather complaints, grocery prices, old memories nobody expected others to remember. Yet little by little, laughter started appearing again. Real laughter. Careful at first, then easier. Rusty moved quietly through the room as though he understood exactly what mattered. He stopped beside Walter during quiet moments, resting gently against the older man's chair. Sat near a nervous little girl, too shy to speak at first. Walked slowly toward a retired veteran sitting alone near the wall and rested beside him without invitation. Somehow, without trying, the old German shepherd kept guiding lonely people gently toward one another. Emily stood near the coffee station halfway through the evening, shaking her head softly. "This is weird," she whispered toward Claire with a tired smile. "Good weird." Claire looked around the room slowly. 30 people maybe. More than she expected. Walter laughing quietly with someone he had not spoken to in years. Mrs. Holloway teaching children old card games near the corner table. Mayor Thomas somehow helping wash dishes without anybody asking him to. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the building no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive, warm, needed. Near the fireplace, Rusty rested quietly on the floor while people occasionally bent to pet him gently. Nobody ignored him anymore. Not after hearing pieces of the story. The oldest shelter dog nobody wanted had somehow become the quiet center of the room. "Funny thing," Walter said softly while stirring soup beside Claire later that evening. "Town used to feel like this." Claire looked around carefully. "What changed?" Walter shrugged slowly. "Life got heavier." His voice softened. People stopped asking for help. Stopped showing up. Silence lingered briefly. Familiar silence. Honest silence. Then he looked toward Rusty resting calmly nearby. "Guess your dog remembered something the rest of us forgot." Claire followed his gaze. The old German shepherd looked peaceful beneath warm firelight, silver fur glowing softly while snow continued falling outside. Yet something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly when she noticed him standing slower lately. Sleeping harder after walks. Breathing heavier some mornings. Age moved quietly but steadily. The shelter had warned her. Rusty did not have forever. That truth sat quietly beneath every good moment now. Later that night, long after most people left with leftovers wrapped carefully in foil and promises to return next week, Claire stayed behind helping clean tables while snow drifted softly outside. The hall felt different now, not forgotten anymore. Hope somehow lingered in old corners. "You know," Emily said quietly while stacking chairs, "people were already asking if this is happening again next Thursday." Claire laughed softly through exhaustion. "Seriously?" Emily nodded. "Apparently lonely people like soup." Walter grinned faintly from near the kitchen doorway. "Turns out lonely people mostly like company." Claire looked toward Rusty resting near the fireplace again. The old German shepherd had already fallen asleep, head resting gently between tired paws. Calm. Safe. Like maybe the work he came here to do had finally started. Weeks passed quietly after that first dinner. Thursday nights grew fuller. More tables. More soup. More stories shared between strangers who slowly stopped feeling like strangers. A small shelf appeared near the entrance holding donated winter coats. Somebody started bringing groceries for struggling families. The retired veteran Rusty sat beside every week, began helping younger men search for jobs. People lingered longer before going home. Smiled more. Checked on neighbors more often. Winter somehow felt less cold when nobody had to carry it alone. Yet through it all, Claire noticed something she tried hard not to think about too much. Rusty moved slower now, sometimes needing longer naps. sometimes pausing halfway through walks as though old bones asked more from him than before. One snowy evening after everyone finally left, Claire sat quietly beside him near the fireplace while soft wind moved outside. She rested one careful hand against his silvered fur. "You really changed everything," she whispered softly. Rusty opened tired eyes briefly and rested his head gently against her knee. Calm, loving, quiet as always. Yet somewhere deep inside her chest, Claire felt something else now too. Gratitude mixed gently with fear. Because sometimes the people who teach us how to heal quietly remind us they cannot stay forever. Winter slowly softened into early spring across Maple Falls, though cold mornings still arrived quietly enough for breath to hang in the air. Snow melted from rooftops one careful day at a time, while sunlight stretched slightly longer across sidewalks that had spent too many months frozen. Thursday evenings at the old community hall had become something nobody questioned anymore. People simply came. Some for soup, some for company, some because loneliness felt easier to carry inside warm rooms filled with familiar voices. Nobody called it extraordinary. Yet somehow the building had quietly become the heartbeat of a town that once forgot how much people needed one another. Folding tables filled faster now. Children laughed near card games. Mrs. Holloway still insisted nobody knew the rules too correctly. Walter no longer sat alone outside the bakery. Emily finally cut back one of her double shifts because volunteers quietly started helping with family expenses after hearing her story. Mayor Thomas visited nearly every Thursday despite pretending he only came to check on maintenance. Somewhere along the way, Maple Falls remembered how community worked again. And always, somewhere near the center of it all, rested Rusty. The old German shepherd moved slower now. Much slower. Some evenings he barely made it from the entrance to the fireplace before lying down with a tired sigh. Other nights, Claire caught him pausing halfway through walks while winter wind moved softly through thinning fur around his silver muzzle. He still greeted people gently. Still somehow found the loneliest person in every room. Yet age no longer moved quietly. It sat beside him now. Visible. Honest. Waiting patiently. Claire noticed everything. The longer naps. The softer appetite. The heavier breathing after stares. Fear arrived quietly too. Not dramatic. Just the quiet understanding that love sometimes carried sadness already folded carefully inside it. One Thursday evening after nearly everyone left, Claire sat beside Rusty near the fireplace, while chairs stood half-stacked around the hall. Warm soup scents still lingered softly in the room. Walter locked the front doors while Emily cleaned cups in the kitchen. Rusty rested his head gently against Claire's leg like always. But tonight something felt different. Slower somehow. Claire brushed careful fingers through fur near his ears. "You do not have to keep working so hard," she whispered softly. Rusty lifted tired eyes toward her for only a moment before resting again. Calm, peaceful, safe. Like somehow he already knew something she was still learning how to accept. A few mornings later, sunlight slipped softly through bedroom curtains, while birds returned cautiously to tree branches outside. Claire woke to unusual stillness. No quiet footsteps downstairs. No gentle movement near the hallway. Her chest tightened immediately. "Rusty," she called softly. Downstairs, morning light stretched gently across the living room rug near the fireplace. Rusty rested peacefully there beneath warm sunlight, head resting quietly between tired paws. Still, calm, as though he had simply fallen asleep after finally deciding everything important had been finished. Claire lowered herself slowly beside him, one trembling hand brushing carefully against silver fur that still felt soft beneath her fingers. Tears came quietly, not sharp grief, not the kind that steals breath. Softer somehow, sadness wrapped gently around gratitude. Because somehow this old, unwanted dog had arrived exactly when loneliness nearly convinced her life would always feel empty. And somehow, impossibly, he had changed everything before asking for nothing at all. Word spread quickly through Maple Falls. Nobody officially organized anything, but somehow people simply came. Walter stood quietly on Claire's porch, carrying flowers his late wife once loved. Emily cried openly while dropping off homemade soup neither of them could eat. Mayor Thomas arrived wearing his old winter coat despite warmer weather. Even people Claire barely knew stopped quietly to say the same thing in different ways. He changed things. Thursday evening came again. Nobody canceled community dinner. Nobody even suggested it. Instead, the hall filled earlier than usual. Candles lined the windows softly, while photographs of Rusty rested near the fireplace. Old pictures people somehow gathered quickly, sleeping near Walter's bench, greeting children at the door, resting quietly beside lonely strangers who no longer looked quite so lonely afterward. Halfway through the evening, Mayor Thomas stood near the front of the room, holding folded papers in quiet hands. Maple Falls forgot something for a while, he said softly. This town forgot how much people need each other. Silence settled gently across the room. An old dog reminded us. He paused briefly before smiling sadly. So beginning next month, his voice softened. This building will officially reopen permanently. Claire blinked through quiet tears. As Rusty House Community Refuge. Nobody clapped immediately. Instead, people simply smiled through tears that felt strangely warm. Months later, spring flowers bloomed quietly outside the building where children played near benches and seniors shared coffee during slow afternoons. Veterans met for breakfast twice a week. Families donated groceries. Nobody ate alone if they did not want it anymore. Near the entrance stood a small bronze statue of an old German shepherd resting peacefully beneath the words, "Sometimes kindness arrives quietly." Claire still visited every Thursday, always bringing fresh flowers for the little spot near the doorway where morning sunlight touched bronze ears just right. And every now and then, when lonely people walked uncertainly through those doors for the first time, she found herself smiling softly because somehow she already knew something they had not learned yet. Sometimes healing begins with the quietest companion in the room.